Hey, good morning. It's Tuesday morning, week 11 of the course. Welcome to week 11. I want to say, as this morning and over the weekend, I was reading through your discussion sections. Looks as though, folks are running maybe a little bit behind for this week. I'm not concerned about that at all, other than to say that this is kind of crunch time, I guess, in the semester. Week 11 through 16, we're into the last month. We do have you're going to be finishing reading the novel Fool's Crow this week. You'll have a really short critical article to read, and I've actually added another little wrinkle now. There'll be like a short documentary. Well, it's an hour long, but you don't need to watch. It's called Indian Relays on sort of contemporary Plains culture sort of folks. It's a PBS documentary, so you'll have a few things to do this week, but you will be finishing the novel, and then we still have one more novel to read. In the last 5 weeks of the course, 5 weeks of the course. So, don't take your foot off the pedal at this point in the semester with this course. Continue to sort of push through and do the work. I want to say I did go through the grade book sometime over break, sometime last week, I know. I went through an update of the grade book, and it's, in other words, I put if you had not turned in an assignment that was past its due date, if you'd failed to turn anything in, I went ahead and put a 0 into the grade book just so people could see, have a good idea of where they stand in the course. Even though I put a 0 on the grade column for the assignment, that does not mean that you cannot still, the assignment will remain open. You can still turn in your work. I will still grade that work and assess it with no penalty assessed. So you have until 5 days after the last day of this course to turn in your work. Which I think equates out to, I don't know, we could look, well, I guess I'll look real quick just to, basically you have until, let me do this really fast. I'm still signed in, give me a moment. Clicking through a computer at this moment, come on. Last day for this class is online, May 13th. You essentially have until about May 18th to turn in all your work for this course. But if you're way behind, then you need to catch up, right? I want to say that this semester, this accounts for a very small percentage of the class, probably somewhere around less than 10%, which is really good for an online course, believe it or not. So, you guys are doing a fantastic job. Just keep it up. Keep reading and keep working, right? I think things will be, you're going to finish up well in the course. Okay, this is where we're at with the, in terms of the, as always, you'll be finishing up reading Fool's Crow, and you're going to have a critical article to read by Betty Whiteman called Closure in Fool's Crow. As always, when we finish reading a novel, you will need to go ahead and there'll be a response paper due. I want us to revisit in the response paper. I want us to go back and look at some of the ideas of sort of authenticity and what we'll be talking about a term called subjectivity. I use the term subjectivity, and all subjectivity really means is, some of you, may have heard this term before, and maybe your sociology classes, or maybe, even history classes. Think of subjectivity in terms of the subject, who you are as an individual, what your thoughts and feelings are, your emotions, how you view the world. It's a sense of self, right? The subject is a sense of self. And inasmuch as the novel Fool's Crow is an exploration of what it means to be a young Beguni male in the mid-19th century over this period of a year and a half, just prior to, as quite frankly, the Blackfeet world is changing rapidly day by day. And the future of the Blackfeet and this particular band is always called into question. How is it that they will survive, right? And what it means, and it's a deeply sort of historical, realistic text. And then Weidman says in Closure, and as you read this last section, the end of the novel, you'll see that the novel takes a very particular turn. Our character of Fool's Crow actually enters into another world, essentially, right? He goes into a psychological state or a dream state, or maybe he even physically sort of enters into this other reality within the novel which has always been there on sort of the margins through the concept of dreams, but he never enters it fully. And in order for the future of his people, or the future of his band to go on, he must sort of enter into this space and then return from it with that body of knowledge. And this is at great risk to the realism of the novel, right? This is a deeply romanticized sense of the Begunny cosmology or the Blackfeet sort of belief system, right? This is putting quite a few things on display, and it runs a risk of sort of taking away from the historical reality of the novel, right? And not only that, right, it also pulls us back to very much, I think, in some ways, close to a novel like what we read with Authenticity, all the way back to sort of Forrest Carter's Little Tree, right? So my question is sort of, does the novel, you know, and Weidman, whether or not we agree with Weidman's article or not, right? You know, whether or not it brings closure, and he's sort of, and you know, she says that he's sort of, you know, that the novel itself sort of beats this risk of it coming this sort of overly sentimental and romanticized text, and it maintains its integrity as an historical novel. But I mean, my question for us is, right, you know, these challenges to the realism of the novel that we see in these final chapters, right? You know, it's not very much unlike what happens in Little Tree. Forrest Carter's Little Tree, and if you'll remember reading back into the section or the viewing of the documentary where Welch talks about this idea of non-Indian people writing about Indian experiences, non-Blackfeet people writing about Blackfeet experiences, I think would be more telling, you know, more refined, I think, for his argument. And I, you know, I'll go out on a limb and say I think that's where he was headed, that Blackfeet should write about Blackfeet experience, right? You know. Why is it then, right, that we would allow, you know, and I'll go out on a limb and say I'm willing to make this allowance, right? I think it's a fantastic novel, right? And I read these elements as works of fiction, right? We have to keep in mind that this is a world of fiction and that this alternate reality is going to be created for us. And I guess I want us to wonder why we would allow the subjectivity of the characters, the self of the character, and maybe even the self of the author, right? Why we would allow Blackfeet to engage in this language and consider it an authentic Blackfeet text, but maybe we don't consider, I certainly wouldn't consider Forrest Carter's Little Tree an authentic Cherokee text. And maybe a lot of that has to do with the experience of being, right? The experience of being a subject, the experience of coming up through a place and time, that as we go back to the reading of, I keep running this back because I want us to sort of begin to make these sort of, this is the point in time in the course where we begin to build on the bodies of knowledge that we've been constructing over the course. So I want us to really assess this. This takes us back to Skip Gates' reading and saying, you know, it's you know, you can fake authenticity, right? It's not impossible to fake authenticity, but I don't think that completely diminishes from the authentic experience, right? And so while authenticity is always already sort of indeterminate, or maybe it's overdetermined, meaning that, you know, we'll never really know. I can't really say that my experience in the world, my cultural experiences in the world as Cherokee or non-Cherokee even, are any more valid than others, right? But I think in some ways we have to leave that up to the viewer. We have to leave those decisions up to the reader. It's your role as a reader to make these very hard decisions as to whether or not Fool's Crow engages into this overly sentimental, this worldview or reality that becomes sort of stereotypical, or if it diminishes from the historical reality of the situation, and the Marias Massacre. You know, and it's important, I think, to keep in mind too that you know, it's not, when these events occurred, there's not that many generations back. So it's not as though these stories might not have been sort of carried down through Welch's family as well. So he, you know, I guess I would ask you to maybe go back and revisit his sort of interview. It was in the first week. I guess that would be week 9 or week 8 of this. Go back and sort of read the interview or view the interview of Welch and sort of his take on how he sort of writes this novel. But in the end, right, we need to sort of consider these bold challenges to the realism of the novel and ask ourselves, in some senses, I think the question that I ask, right, is what do you think of the sentimentality or the romanticization of the Begunny Whiteman refers to in her brief article, right? She draws attention to the parts of the story where the reader listens to Conversations with Raven, experiences Sundance Sacrifice, etc., as challenges to the realism of the novel. Does the novel lose any sense of its realism because of this, right? Does it lose any sense of its authenticity? And, you know, while I'm willing to argue that there is a loss of authenticity in a work like Forrest Carter's, and there's not a loss in an authenticity in the work of Fool's Crow, and I'm asking you, and I'm not going to provide you with my answer, right? I think I just did. It's in the experience of the subject, and the author matters, right? I think somewhat. I very much think it does. And so, as an antidote to that, right? Here's the antidote to that. And one thing that I want you to take away when you watch the documentary, and you can watch all of it or part. It's about a 55-minute documentary on. So it's a PBS documentary called Indian Relays, and it's on horse culture, contemporary horse cultures of Northern Plains folks, right? And I want you to see the contemporary lives, excuse me, of the Blackfeet and the Nez Perce, and the very people that are written about in this novel, Fool's Crow. I want you to see what their lives are like in the contemporary setting, right? So that you can see that the representations that you walk away with from Fool's Crow are in no way, right, are in some ways, you know, they are connected to, but the contemporary lives of Blackfeet people are very much different than the lives that we read in this novel, right? So look at these different representations of sort of Blackfeetness and sort of what it means to be a young man, sort of in Blackfeet culture. And I want you to sort of consider the, you know, I'll change up the response paper assignment a little bit to take into account that documentary film. All right, as always, I've got on way too long. Any questions, and I may have rambled a bit, I'm sorry. Any questions at all about the assignments, any questions at all about the work, just let me know. And I'm happy to sort of answer those questions for you. If you're running behind in the course and want to send me an email to talk about it, that's great too. Give me a call. We have lots of options available to you, but we are getting closer and closer to the point where we can't withdraw in the course. All right, I will let you go. Thank you so much, and we'll talk next week. After we just say, our next novel that we'll be reading after Fool's Crow will be Louise Erdrich's Love Medicine, and we'll talk more about that next week. All right, thanks so much, and watch